I was looking at a competitor listing online when I saw it. A new brand, 3 cities, launched quietly over the previous 6 months. I clicked through, read the About page, looked at the logo, the color scheme, the operational language describing the service, and I felt something very specific. Not confusion, recognition, because what I was looking at was mine. Not exactly mine. One word different in the name. The colors shifted by a shade. The logo rotated slightly. Just enough distance to claim it was something else. Not enough distance to be something else. I sat at my desk for a long moment. Then I opened my contacts, found the email thread from the franchise negotiations. The one that had gone quiet 8 months earlier when Victor stopped responding. I read it from the beginning. Every email where I had shared the brand guidelines, the operational systems, the supplier contacts, the pricing models, everything I had given him in good faith across months of serious negotiation. I closed the laptop, picked up my phone, and called my lawyer. But to understand why that call felt the way it did, you need to know what 5 years of building actually looks like. The brand didn't start as a brand. It started as a problem I kept noticing that nobody around me seemed interested in solving properly. I had been working in the industry for several years before I went out on my own, long enough to understand the landscape, where the genuine needs were, where the existing operators were falling short, where a customer base was being underserved in ways that were visible to anyone paying the right kind of attention. I was paying the right kind of attention. The idea for the business came from that attention, not from inspiration, from observation. The specific and methodical observation of someone who has spent enough time inside an industry to understand the difference between what it offers and what it should offer. I started small, one location, minimal overhead. The deliberate constraint of someone who understands that proving a concept at small scale before investing in larger scale is not caution. It is intelligence. The first year was the year of fundamentals. Getting the service right, getting the customer experience right, getting the operational systems right in a way that would allow them to be replicated if the concept proved itself worth replicating. That last part mattered more than it seemed to at the time. I documented everything, not because I was certain the business would grow to a point where documentation would be necessary, because documenting your systems is the discipline of someone who takes what they are building seriously, who treats a small operation with the same rigor they would bring to a large one, who understands that the habits established at the beginning are the ones the business runs on later. The brand emerged from the second year, not designed in a single sitting, developed over time through the accumulation of decisions that were each individually small but collectively produced something coherent. The name came first. Simple, specific, memorable in the way that names are memorable when they describe something real rather than something aspirational. The visual identity followed. Color scheme developed through iteration rather than a single inspired choice. Logo refined until it had the particular quality of something that looks simple but that carries real work in how it arrived at that simplicity. The tone of voice. How the brand communicated, the specific language it used and didn't use. All of it developed carefully over many months. By the end of the second year, the brand had a coherence that people noticed, not industry observers, customers, the people who experienced it repeatedly and began to develop the specific loyalty that a well-built brand generates. Not loyalty to the product alone, to the whole thing, the name, the look, the consistent experience of engaging with something that knew what it was. Word of mouth grew the customer base through the third and fourth years, not through significant marketing spend, through genuine recommendation. People telling other people about a brand they found consistently good. The specific and valuable kind of growth that advertising cannot buy. By the end of year 4, I had a recognizable local brand, a loyal customer base, an operational system refined through years of iteration into something that worked efficiently and could be trained and replicated. Supplier relationships built through consistency and volume, and the trust that develops when you pay on time and communicate clearly. A reputation that had been earned through 5 years of showing up and doing the work correctly. All of it mine, built from nothing, through the specific effort of someone who had seen a gap and spent 5 years filling it with something real. Victor made contact in the spring of year 5. His message was professional, well-written, the kind of initial approach that tells you the person has done some research before reaching out. He said he had been watching the brand with interest, that he thought the concept had significant expansion potential, that he had the capital and the operational infrastructure to take it to multiple new markets, that he wanted to discuss a franchise arrangement. I read it twice, felt the particular combination of excitement and caution that arrives when something you have been building toward begins to feel possible, and replied that I was open to a conversation. Victor was impressive in the first meeting. I want to be honest about that, because understanding how I was taken in requires understanding what I was taken in by. He was not a crude operator. He was not someone who came in with obvious aggression or transparent self-interest. He was polished, knowledgeable about the industry, fluent in the language of scaling and brand consistency and franchise systems in a way that suggested genuine experience. He asked good questions, the kind that tell you someone has done their research, that they have looked at what you have built and understood it well enough to identify what made it work. He talked about his existing operations, the markets he was in, the infrastructure he had built for managing multiple locations across different cities, the capital available for the right expansion opportunity, all of it presented with the confidence of someone who had done this before and knew what he was doing. I was genuinely interested, not dazzled, interested, in the way you are interested when someone credible appears to be offering something you have been working toward. The second meeting went deeper. We talked about what a franchise arrangement would actually look like, the structure, the economics, the division of responsibility between franchisor and franchisee, the brand standards and how they would be maintained across multiple locations under different operational management. These conversations require me to articulate things about the brand and the business that I had not previously needed to articulate to anyone outside it. How the visual identity worked and why it worked. What the operational systems were designed to achieve. What the supplier relationships have been built on and what made them valuable. The specific elements that made the customer experience consistent. I articulated all of it, clearly, in increasing detail as the conversations deepened, because that is what serious franchise negotiations require. The potential partner needs to understand the thing they are proposing to replicate, need to see inside it, needs enough detail to assess whether the concept is genuinely transferable to new markets. I understood that, and I provided it, with the good faith of someone who believed they were in a legitimate process moving toward a legitimate outcome. Victor requested documents, brand guidelines, operational manuals, supplier contracts and contacts, pricing models, training frameworks, everything that a franchise operator would need to understand the system they were proposing to license. I prepared them carefully, professionally presented, complete, the kind of documentation that reflected the rigor I had brought to building the business itself. I sent them over. Victor confirmed receipt, said the documents were impressive, that it was clear the brand had been built with real discipline, that he was increasingly confident this was the right opportunity. The conversations continued for several more weeks. Terms were discussed in general, royalty structures, territory rights, brand control provisions, timeline for the first new location, all of it moving forward in the way that serious negotiations move. With enough momentum to feel real, with enough specificity to feel close. Then Victor went quiet, not immediately, gradually, the way someone goes quiet when they're managing a withdrawal rather than simply becoming busy. Responses that had been prompt became slow, then infrequent, then absent. I followed up twice. Both times received brief responses that said he was working through some internal considerations, that he would be in touch shortly. shortly extended, then stopped entirely. I gave it 2 more weeks. Sent a final message asking directly whether he intended to continue the conversation. No response. I filed it as a franchise opportunity that had not progressed. Disappointing, but not unusual. These things fall through for various reasons. Capital availability changes. Priorities shift. Operators look at multiple opportunities and pursue the ones that best fit their current position. I had not signed anything, had not received anything, had simply invested time in a process that had not produced the outcome I had hoped for. I moved on, went back to the work of running and growing what I had. For 6 months, I gave Victor no further thought. Until the evening, I was doing routine competitor research online and found myself looking at something I recognized. I spent 2 hours on the site before I called anyone, not because I needed 2 hours to be certain. I was certain within the first 5 minutes. I spent the 2 hours documenting screenshots of every page, the logo from multiple angles, the color codes pulled from the source files, the operational language from the About page and the service descriptions, the supplier names visible in the acknowledgement section, the specific phrasing used to describe the customer experience. All of it captured, time-stamped, saved in a folder organized by category. Because the feeling I had looking at what Victor had built was not just personal, it was legal. And legal situations require documentation gathered before you announce that you know what you have found, before the other party has any reason to start adjusting what is publicly visible. I was methodical about it, the same way I had been methodical about building the brand in the first place, the same way I had been methodical about documenting the operational systems I had sent to Victor during the negotiations. Documentation as discipline, not reactive, systematic. When I had captured everything available publicly, I opened the email thread. Read back through 6 months of franchise conversations with the specific attention of someone who now understood what those conversations had actually been. Not negotiations, research. Victor had not been assessing whether to license my brand. He had been assessing what he needed to understand about it in order to replicate it. Every question he had asked about the visual identity, every request for operational documentation, every conversation about supplier relationships and pricing models and training frameworks. All of it due diligence for his own project, dressed in the language of a partnership that was never going to happen. The specific cynicism of that was something I sat with for a moment. The performance of genuine interest maintained across months of meetings and documents and detailed conversations. The patience it required, the calculation underneath the warmth. Then I put it aside, because the feeling it produced was not useful yet. What was useful was the folder of screenshots, and the email thread, and the supplier contracts I had sent him that now appeared to be informing relationships his new operation had established. I called my lawyer the following morning. Her name was Ms. Osei. She had handled the business's legal work since the early years. Contracts, trademark registration, the standard legal infrastructure of a growing small business. I had registered the trademark on the brand name and logo at her recommendation in year 2. At the time, it had felt like a precaution against a hypothetical I hadn't been able to specifically imagine. Now, it was the foundation of everything. I sent her the documentation folder before the call. She reviewed it during the call, asked specific questions about the timeline of the negotiations, about what had been shared and when, about the trademark registration details, about the specific elements of Victor's new brand that most clearly mirrored mine. I answered everything she asked. She was quiet for a moment after the last question. Then she said what I needed to hear. She said the trademark registration was clean and defensible, that the visual similarities between the two brands were significant enough to constitute a clear case for infringement, that the operational and supplier documentation I had shared under what was implicitly a confidential negotiation had been used in a way that created additional legal exposure for Victor, that the combination of trademark infringement and misuse of confidential information shared during a negotiation process was a strong foundation for legal action. She said it with the measured confidence of someone who has looked at the evidence and assessed it honestly, not inflating it, not managing my expectations downward either, just giving me an accurate picture of where things stood. I asked her what the realistic outcome looked like. She said it depended on how Victor responded. That operators in his position typically made one of two calculations when faced with a legitimate legal challenge. They either fought it hoping the smaller party would run out of resources before the case resolved, or they settled when they understood the case was strong enough that fighting it would cost more than settling. She said the documentation I had made the second calculation significantly more likely, because Victor would receive the legal claim with the evidence attached, and the evidence made the first calculation look expensive. I authorized her to proceed. She began preparing the formal claim that afternoon. I went back to work, not distracted, not consumed by what was running in the background, just running my business the way I had been running it for 5 years, with the same consistency that had built the thing Victor had decided was worth taking. The irony of that was not lost on me. He had believed the brand was valuable enough to replicate, had spent months understanding exactly what made it work, and had then assumed the person who built it was too small to defend it. That assumption was the most expensive mistake he made, more expensive than the rebranding he was about to be required to undertake, more expensive than the compensation, more expensive than the public acknowledgement that would follow. The assumption that small means powerless, that building something carefully for 5 years doesn't produce someone capable of protecting it precisely. It does. It produces exactly that. Victor received the formal claim on a Thursday. Ms. Osei confirmed it had been served. I went about my Thursday the way I went about most Thursdays. Work. The ordinary operational rhythm of a business that continues regardless of what is happening in the legal background. I had made a deliberate decision at the start of the process to keep the two things separate. The legal process would run at its own pace through the right channels. The business would continue at its own pace through its normal operations. Mixing the two, allowing the legal situation to consume the energy that belonged to the business, would have been a mistake. Victor's first response came through his legal representation about 10 days after service. Ms. Osei briefed me on the content. His position was the one she had anticipated: denial of infringement. The argument that the similarities between the two brands were not substantial enough to constitute a legal violation, that the name difference was meaningful, that the color scheme was not protected by the trademark, that the operational systems were independently developed, that the supplier relationships had been established through his own existing industry contacts rather than through anything shared during our negotiations. That last claim was the most interesting, because the supplier documentation I had sent him during the negotiations contained specific contacts that were not widely known in the industry. Small operators whose relationships I had built through years of direct engagement, who did not appear in any industry directory, whose details would have been difficult to arrive at independently. Victor's new operation was using 3 of them. Ms. Osei had identified this early, had noted it with the specific satisfaction of someone who has found the element of a case that is hardest to explain away, because coincidence has limits, and the presence of 3 non-public supplier contacts in an operation run by the person you had sent those contacts to during what was presented as a confidential negotiation was not a coincidence that a reasonable person could accept. She responded to Victor's legal team with a full documentation. The email thread showing the sequence of what was shared and when. The trademark registration with its date clearly preceding Victor's brand launch by 3 years. The color code analysis showing the similarity between the two schemes. The logo comparison conducted by a design professional Ms. Osei had engaged as an expert. The supplier contact evidence. The operational language comparison pulled from both brands' public documentation. Everything assembled into a response that addressed each of Victor's denials with specific evidence. The response to that from Victor's team was slower than the first one, which was information. When a legal team responds quickly, it means they had the counter-arguments ready. When they take longer, it means they are reassessing the position. A slow response after a strong evidentiary submission means the reassessment is significant. Ms. Osei said the pace of their response told her something useful, that the evidence had landed the way she had hoped. I waited, not anxiously, with the particular patience of someone who has placed the situation in the right hands and trusts the process to do what the process is designed to do. The second response came with a different tone, still formal, still professionally defensive, but with a quality that Ms. Osei identified immediately. The quality of a position beginning to look for a way out rather than a way through. Victor's team raised the possibility of a mediated resolution, said their client was open to discussing terms that could resolve the matter without further legal proceedings. Ms. Osei told me this was the moment I had prepared for, that the shift from denial to negotiation meant Victor had looked at the evidence properly and understood that fighting it was more expensive than addressing it. She said I needed to be clear on what resolution actually required, not just compensation, a full rebranding of Victor's operation, complete removal of the infringing elements, public acknowledgement of the original brand and its precedents, documentation that the dispute had been resolved in my favor in a form that could be shared if the situation ever arose again. She said to go in with the full position and not to soften it preemptively, that the evidence supported the full position, and that Victor knew it. I told her to proceed on that basis. She did. The mediation process took several weeks. Victor's team pushed back on specific elements, argued for a more limited public acknowledgement, argued for a reduced compensation figure, argued for a longer rebranding timeline. Ms. Osei held the position on the elements that mattered. The rebranding was non-negotiable. The public acknowledgement was non-negotiable. The compensation figure was where movement was possible within a range she had defined in advance. She moved within that range, not outside it. The final agreement reflected the position we had gone in with on every substantive point. The compensation was meaningful. The rebranding was complete and mandatory. The public acknowledgement was specific and clear. Victor had not got what he had taken. He had got the cost of having taken it, which is the correct outcome, and exactly what 5 years of careful building and one call to the right lawyer had produced. The rebranding requirement landed on Victor's operation in the specific way that mandatory rebranding lands on a business that has spent money establishing itself under the infringing identity. Not just a name change. Everything. The signage across 3 locations. The digital presence. The marketing materials. The operational documentation carrying the brand identity. The supplier communications referencing the brand. All of it requiring replacement, at the cost of the operation that had built on a foundation it had no right to build on. I want to describe what that process looked like from my side, which was mostly invisible. I wasn't present for any of it, had no direct visibility into the mechanics of Victor unwinding what he had constructed. What I knew through Ms. Osei. Through the formal confirmation that each element of the agreement was being complied with on the required timeline, through the public acknowledgement that appeared in the agreed format. That acknowledgement was brief, professionally worded in the way that legal agreements produce professionally worded public statements. But its content was clear. It confirmed the original brand, its precedents, the resolution of the dispute in terms that anyone reading carefully would understand meant the original brand had prevailed. It did not use the word copied. It did not need to. The shape of the statement said what the words were carefully chosen not to say explicitly, and people in the industry read the shape. That is when the unexpected thing happened. The thing Ms. Osei had suggested was possible, but that I hadn't allowed myself to count on. The story moved, not through any action I took, through the natural circulation of information in an industry where people pay attention to who is building what and how disputes resolve. Someone wrote about it. A small industry publication, the kind that covers franchise and brand news for a specific professional audience. They had seen the public acknowledgement and done their own research, had found enough of the publicly available information to piece together a version of what had happened. The piece they wrote was careful, factual. It described an independent brand operator who had built a recognizable identity over 5 years, had entered franchise negotiations with a larger operator, had found their brand replicated without agreement, had pursued legal action, and had prevailed, forcing a complete rebranding and receiving compensation and public acknowledgement. The piece did not name Victor explicitly. It named my brand, with approval, with the specific language of a publication describing something worth paying attention to. I read it the morning it published, sat with it for a moment, then forwarded it to Ms. Osei with a brief message. She replied with a single line, said she had seen it, said it was well-deserved. The response to that piece was something I had not anticipated in scale. Inquiries from other independent operators who had experienced similar situations and wanted to understand how I had approached it. Interest from franchise consultants who had followed the situation and wanted to connect. 2 serious franchise inquiries from operators whose approach and reputation were considerably more aligned with what I had built and Victor's had ever been. All of it arriving not through the years of patient organic growth, through the 3 months of legal process that had resolved in public view. The brand had more visibility after the dispute than it had accumulated in 5 years of building. Not because the dispute was good, because the way it had been handled said something specific about the brand and the person behind it, that it was built on something real, that it was defended because it was worth defending, that the operator behind it was someone who knew what they had and was not going to allow someone with more capital to simply take it. Those things communicate something to other operators, to potential partners, to customers who follow industry news, to anyone who understands what it means when a small brand takes on a larger operator and wins. It means the small brand is not as small as it looks from the outside. It means the thing built quietly over 5 years has more substance than the people who assumed they could take it had understood. Victor had made a specific calculation, that I was too small to fight back effectively, that the cost of pursuing him would exceed my resources before the case resolved in my favor. That small operators absorb these things rather than challenge them, because the challenge costs more than the outcome is worth. That calculation was wrong on every count. The trademark registration made the legal foundation solid. The documentation I had kept made the evidence clear. Ms. Osei made the process efficient. And the outcome was not just the resolution of the specific dispute. It was a signal, sent to anyone in the industry who was paying attention, that this brand was defended, that this operator knew what they had built, and that anyone who decided to treat that brand as something they could take without consequence had significantly misjudged the situation. The 2 serious franchise inquiries that arrived after the story move took several months to develop properly. I want to ascribe that process honestly, because it would be easy to frame the outcome as an immediate and complete transformation. A dispute resolved and a franchise operation launched, and everything suddenly different. That is not how it happened. What happened was more gradual and more genuinely earned than that version suggests. The first inquiry came from an operator in a city about 3 hours away. Established, multi-site, a track record in an adjacent service category that demonstrated genuine operational competence rather than just available capital. She had seen the industry piece, had done her own research before making contact. Her first message demonstrated that research clearly. She knew the brand, understood what made it work, asked questions that told me she had looked carefully before deciding to reach out. That quality of preparation was immediately different from Victor's approach. Victor had come in knowing what he wanted to take. She came in knowing what she wanted to build. The distinction was visible from the first conversation. The second inquiry came from a smaller operator. Single location, less capital than the first, but a specific market position in his city that aligned well with what the brand did and who it served. He was less polished than the first, more direct. Said he had been looking for something worth aligning with for 2 years and hadn't found it until he read about how the dispute had resolved. That the way I had handled it told him something about how the brand operated that no amount of marketing would have communicated. I found that observation worth sitting with. He was right. The legal story had communicated something about the brand's character that 5 years of organic growth had not managed to make visible at scale. Not just that the brand existed, that it had substance behind it, that the person who built it took it seriously enough to defend it properly, that the systems and standards that made it worth franchising were maintained because the person behind them understood their value. All of that had become legible through the dispute in a way it hadn't been before. I worked with Ms. Osei to develop a proper franchise agreement before either conversation advanced to the stage of serious terms. Not the improvised framework of the Victor negotiation, a complete and properly constructed legal document, specific on intellectual property protections, specific on what was being licensed and what was not, specific on confidentiality obligations applying to everything shared during the negotiation process regardless of whether a final agreement was reached. That last element was the one that had been absent before, the gap that Victor had operated through. I closed it, documented the closure properly, and ensured that no future negotiation would carry the exposure that the Victor process had carried. Ms. Osei reviewed the agreement in detail, suggested several additions that strengthened the franchisor's position without making the terms unreasonable for a genuine partner. I incorporated every suggestion. The agreement that emerged was thorough, more thorough than anything I had when Victor approached, built from the specific knowledge of what happens when thoroughness is absent. The first franchise agreement was signed with the operator in the city 3 hours away. Her first franchise location opened about 8 months after our initial contact. The process was smoother than I had expected, because she had come an understanding where she was joining, had done the preparation to know what the brand required, and had the operational competence to meet those requirements without significant correction. The brand standards held across the new location in a way that reflected well on both sides, on the framework I had built for ensuring consistency, and on her commitment to operating within it honestly. The second franchise agreement followed about 4 months later. The smaller operator's location opened in the spring. Different market, different operational context, but the same fundamental thing being delivered to customers who found it the same way customers in the original location had found it, through genuine quality and consistent experience and a specific reputation that both of those produce over time. I want to say something about Victor, not with satisfaction exactly, more with the particular clarity that comes from having processed something completely. His operation continued after the rebranding, under a different identity, without the elements he had taken. Whether it succeeded or struggled, I did not follow closely. It was not relevant to what I was building. What he had done was calculated and deliberate, and had cost me time and energy in a period of significant stress. But it had also produced something I would not have had without it. Not just the compensation, the trademark enforced in public, the franchise agreement properly constructed, the industry visibility, the 2 operators who came because of how the dispute resolved, the specific knowledge of exactly how to protect what I had built against the next person who might look at it and decide it was easier to take than to build. All of that came from the situation Victor created. He had assumed that taking from a small operator would cost him nothing. It cost him the rebranding, the compensation, the public acknowledgement, and the industry reputation of someone who had been caught doing something the industry understood clearly when the shape of the settlement was visible. None of that was something I had engineered. It was simply what followed from doing the right things in the right order. Registering the trademark when Ms. Osei recommended it. Documenting everything carefully throughout the negotiation. calling her immediately when I found what Victor had built, following the legal process with patience and without the reactive urgency that would have made it messier than it needed to be. The brand is in 3 cities now, not Victor's 3 cities, different ones, under genuine franchise arrangements with operators who chose to be there, who prepared before they came, who understood what they were joining, and who are building something real within it. That is the outcome 5 years of work deserved, not the outcome Victor's negotiation was designed to produce. The correct one, arrived at through the specific combination of preparation, documentation, the right legal advice, and the willingness to defend what was worth defending, even when the person on the other side assumed you wouldn't. Especially then. The people who assume you're too small to fight back have usually never met someone who built something carefully enough to know exactly what is worth defending. If this story resonated with you, the preparation of it, the importance of protecting what you build before someone else decides to take it, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.